I want to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Lorri Glover is the John Francis Bannon Endowed Chair in the History Department at St. Louis University. A native of Alabama and a graduate of the University of North Alabama, she earned her MA from Clemson and her PhD from the University of Kentucky. Dr. Glover is a past president of the Southern Association for Women Historians and the author or editor of over 10 books. Her first book, All Our Relations, Blood Ties and Emotional Bonds Among the Early South Carolina Gentry, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2000 and centered on the complex and powerful kinship ties that bound together colonial South Carolina elites. And her research for that project began at the South Carolina Historical Society. She returned to South Carolina to research her latest book, Eliza Lucas Pinckney, An Independent Woman in the Age of Revolution, which was published last year by Yale University Press. So welcome to Dr. Glover. We are delighted to have you with us. And at this point, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Faye, for inviting me. Thanks to everyone for coming out this evening. I saw in the chat that I have several friends in the audience, including Bea Burton and Ivy McIntyre, and Connie Schultz is here, and maybe others I missed in the chat. So I really wish I could be in Charleston for many, many reasons, including it's currently 21 degrees in St. Louis, but we have to be safe. And so in any event, I'm thrilled to be talking about Eliza Lucas Pinckney this evening. And we'll look forward to your questions and comments near the end. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some visuals. And if you can't see, the pictures, then I think you should probably just message either Virginia or Faye in the chat, and they maybe can coach you along. So we sometimes think of, in our mind's eye, colonial America being primarily a man's world. There are the monarchs and merchant adventurers in Europe who carved up the so-called New World, the colonizers who voyaged into the Americas, who dispossessed Indians of their lands and enslaved Africans and created colonies and then family-based empires. They were in British America, they were formidable and brutal and ambitious. By the 18th century, they had become, over generations, sort of quintessential planter patriarchs, famous men presiding over grand estates. You'll probably recognize these from Virginia and from South Carolina. They spread across the southern provinces and down into the Caribbean, headed by savvy entrepreneurs, agricultural innovators, cultural trendsetters who had built businesses on human trafficking and on the global marketing of commodities produced on plantations. So most of the planter patriarchs, the transatlantic entrepreneurs, were men, but not all of them. And historians have done over the last few decades an increasingly good job of recovering the lives of powerful women. If you'd like to read more about women in the early modern world, then I highly recommend these three fairly recent books. And I've spent time over the last 5 years trying to recover the life of another woman, Eliza Lucas Pinckney. So this is her dress. It's at the Smithsonian Institute. There's a second dress I'll show you in just a bit at the Charleston Museum. I would like to show you Eliza's painting, but she never sat for one. And this, I think, was an intentional decision that reflected her values. Well, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So let me go back into her past. Eliza was lucky from the outset of her life. She was born white and rich on the English colony of Antigua in what the English call the Leeward Islands. So the first map on the left is of the West Indies. Going clockwise, the yellow circled map is of the island of Antigua. If you start at the bottom of that map, and look up and slightly to the right, you may be able to see the words Lucas with three little dots above it. That's because the Lucas family had 3 windmills on their property, which was a signal of how wealthy they were. They also had a house in St. John's, which is the capital city of Antigua, and that's the third map. So I said Eliza was lucky. She was born into a world in which most children in Antigua were Black and condemned to a life of bondage before they even drew their first breath. She also descended from a very well-off and powerful family. The Lucases were perched at the top of colonial society. She grew up exploring the Central Valley of Antigua, again, where her family lived on sugar plantations. The rambling Lucas estates fed her precocious curiosity about the natural world. And then she had time in the city as well. So when you write a biography, you develop sort of snapshots or images in your mind of formative periods in your subject's life. And Eliza walking with her father through the streets of St. John's is one of the first, I guess, images I've created for myself to try and understand her life. When they walk through St. John's, gentlemen would have tipped their hats, enslaved people averted their eyes, what elites call the lesser sort would have stepped aside, so that Eliza Lucas could have had no memory of her childhood separated from the displays of her family's power that were orchestrated and enacted through daily life, and by extension, her own power as well. So this is a sugar mill of the sort the Lucases had 3 on Antigua. The picture doesn't convey it, but the slavery that was affected on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and really the slavery that was affected throughout the Atlantic world, depended on violence. And colonial planters weren't ashamed of the violence that they inflicted through enslavement, and they didn't try to shield their children from it. Instead, they went about instilling in their children the importance of racial power and the necessity of racialized violence, so that before she knew the words to express it, Eliza would have felt the power fixed on her by her birth and by her color. It was impossible in the world that she lived in that a girl who looked like her would work in these conditions. So Eliza's parents saw in her a very promising intellect, and they sent her to England when she was barely 10 years old for what turned out to be a quite long and extensive education. She returned 5+ years later, a young woman that they hardly could have recognized. And so this is another picture I have in my mind's eye of formative things in Eliza's life. I always think, what a thing to send across an ocean a 10-year-old and welcome back a 15-year-old. And what a thing to be a child who's lived only on a tiny island, and to leave that world, to travel alone to the center of the English-speaking world, to grow up there, to grow intellectually there, and then to go back home again. Antigua, during the years of Eliza's absence, was beset by a series of disasters: hurricanes, drought, infestations, and then an economic collapse, and finally an aborted slave uprising. So that as Eliza completed her studies in London, her father had decided that the family should leave the colony that had been home to the Lucases for 3 generations and try again in a place with a brighter financial future that seemed more stable on the mainland of North America. And they settled in the South Carolina Low Country. No sooner had they moved into the Low Country than Eliza's mother and Mildred fell badly ill. Now, I can explain in the Q&A, maybe some of you already know, but I can explain in the Q&A why Anne's, Eliza's mother had a different name than her and the rest of the family. But in any event, she got quite sick. And then Eliza's father, George Lucas, got recalled to his military appointment in the Caribbean. So Eliza took charge of the family and of the estate, which included 3 plantations, scores of enslaved people, and the international trafficking of crops. At this point, she was 17 years old. Driven by her own ambition and by a fierce sense of duty to her father, who she loved very much, they had I think, a very close relationship. She set about trying to become a first-rate planter patriarch with everything that entailed. Her principal business at that point was in rice production. So this is a period drawing of how rice works operated. You'll see that in the centerpiece and then at the bottom, the people who are in the command position are men. That's the way it almost always was in the drawings, but it wasn't always that way in life. So Eliza also began at this period cataloging her work in a letter book, which perhaps is well known to many people who are from South Carolina, though I know in the chat, we have people all the way from New England to Washington State here tonight, which is, the world is a wonder. For those of you who don't know, the letter book contained copies of letters that Eliza sent to her father, to factors and lawyers in the Imperial Center, and to neighbors and friends that she made in South Carolina. So every letter she wrote, she copied again in this book. And so on the right-hand side is the letter book itself, and on the left-hand side is her script, and you can see how the letter book works. So one letter ends, and then she writes, "Honored Sir," and that letter continues. So this was an odd thing for a teenage girl to start doing, because the people in colonial America who kept letter books were powerful political leaders, merchants, attorneys, people who conducted business over a long period of time and a long span of space and needed to keep copious records of their correspondence. Eliza took to the writing life, and soon her writings expanded beyond the letter book to become the most voluminous and I think revealing cache of materials for any woman who lived in the 18th century South or Caribbean, and I will argue for any woman who lived in 18th century British America. So first, her descendants over generations kept the writings safe, and they passed them down over time until they became mostly housed in professional archives, although Virginia told me that they recently acquired some new Pinckney materials. And the principal repository for Eliza's writings is the South Carolina Historical Society. Now, Connie Schulz, who is here tonight, in the last decade, led a team of scholars out of the University of South Carolina to create a magnificent digital project, transcribing and publishing all of the writings of Eliza Lucas Pinckney and her equally interesting daughter, Harriet Pinckney Lorri. And so those are available now, thanks to Connie and her team's work. Well, like any source, the letter book and Eliza's other writings have biases, limitations, and flaws, but they are also remarkably revealing. And so I want to spend some time talking about the things I learned about Eliza and her world and a woman's point of view on the 18th century from those writings. In the early spring of 1742, a comet blazed across the South Carolina night sky. Now, Eliza loved the natural world. She had boundless curiosity about it, and she was not about to let this unique opportunity pass her by. So she got up in the middle of the night to watch for the comet. Now, Eliza was very cosmopolitan for a girl of her place and time. She has studied the night skies in the Caribbean, in Europe, and on the mainland of North America, but she had never seen anything like the comet. She had a friend, a neighbor, Mary Bartlett, and she and Mary corresponded about the comet. And among the things they did was to kind of make fun of older people who had old-timey ideas about comets, that they carried the souls of recently departed people. So Mary asked Eliza in jest if she thought the comet was a man or a woman. And Eliza wrote back, continuing the joke, that the comet had made its, she said, modest appearance in the pre-dawn hours, so that not just any idle gazer could behold its splendor. Clearly, Eliza joked, the comet was female. Besides, and here she drops the humor, she added, if it is any mortal transformed to this glorious luminary, why not a woman? Why not a woman was an audacious thing to ask in 1742. Everything in Eliza's world was supposed to be centered on hierarchy, including gender hierarchy. So women were supposed to defer to men and be subordinate to men, just like children were to parents. The laws of South Carolina decreed it, ministers preached about it, families expected and modeled it, and communities monitored it. So that's the way the world was supposed to be. But not all women complied with the way the world was supposed to be. Eliza Lucas was not only asking why not a woman, she was living the question. 20-year-old Eliza in another letter wrote, I am so busy in providing for posterity that I hardly allow myself time to eat or sleep. She was at this point 3 years into the management of 3 plantations and the international marketing of commodities that the people she enslaved produced on those estates. She also managed the household, took care of her ailing mother, tutored her younger sister, and represented the Lucas family in Charlestown, which was very important for their social standing as well as for her businesses. And she had recently begun to be a lay lawyer for several of her neighbors, writing wills. Eliza reflected on her life with a mix of pride and fatigue. I shall begin to think myself an old woman, she wrote, before I am well a young one, having these weighty affairs upon my hands. By 1742, Eliza was also well into a series of agricultural experiments born out of her interest in botany, or as she put it, this is one of my favorite quotes from her, I love the vegetable world extremely. And I just think that's classic, Eliza. Now, her principal residence was at Wapu Plantation. So if you leave Charlestown Harbor, those of you who don't know or aren't in the area or don't know the area, if you follow this map, Charlestown Harbor, up the Ashley River, go left on Wapu Creek toward the Stono River, that's where the principal estate was. And there's, it's a subdivision now, but there is a marker, and I included my, I guess, off-centered photograph of the marker. I include as well a second marker about Eliza Lucas Pinckney, which is in a cemetery in Philadelphia, which for some time, somewhere, Eliza was buried. And I include those markers because in the first one, her name is misspelled. In the second one, the date of her birth is inaccurate, and her daughter Harriet is erased from her life. And the markers to me show the ways in which 18th century women get remembered and confused and forgotten. So at Wapu, this plantation on Wapu Creek headed toward the Stono River, Eliza experimented with various crops, cotton, alfalfa, ginger. She called them her schemes. And far from thinking about these as dalliances of a teenage girl, her father, George Lucas, and the planters around the Low Country who got to know her took Eliza and her work very seriously. She was an entrepreneur at heart and ever an optimist, and she refused to give up on her schemes, even when several failed. Out of many, she calculated, surely one will hit. And boy, did it. And those of you who have been to the Charleston Museum or the South Carolina Historical Society will know the role that Eliza Lucas played in indigo cultivation. So indigo is not much used today, but it was very important and very lucrative in the 18th century. The French mostly dominated the indigo trade until a cohort of South Carolinians, including Eliza, and she was the only woman with other men, began experiments to begin mass production of indigo on a commercial scale using slave labor. So today we know the chemical processes that produce indigo dye that produces all the rich colors of blue that you can see in the picture. But in the colonial period, it was kind of like distilling whiskey. You did it through sight and smell and a lot of experience and some good luck. So again, Eliza collaborated on her indigo experiments with a group of other planters. And even though she failed, she persevered. I hate to undertake anything, she said, and not go through with it. Within a decade, thanks to Eliza and the other planters' collaboration, indigo became the second most important crop produced in colonial South Carolina, and it remained a cornerstone of the economy until the American Revolution. It was a point of great pride to Eliza and her descendants that she played a pivotal role in indigo production. So this is an artist's drawing of how indigo is produced. I could bore you to death with descriptions of how indigo is produced, but I won't. This is the canopy of Eliza's bed, which is housed at the Charleston Museum. It shows an indigo plant, and it's also dyed with indigo. So she and her children also made sure that her indigo scheme got written into the history of South Carolina, first in the works of David Ramsay, and then in successive generations of people who wrote about South Carolina history. In the mid-1740s, Eliza fell in love with a much older man, Charles Pinckney. She was 21 when they married, and he was 44 and a recent widower. Eliza was friends with the first Mrs. Pinckney, whose name was Elizabeth, and she actually helped Charles to take care of Elizabeth as she got sick and lay dying. Eliza and Charles married 4 months after Elizabeth Pinckney's funeral. It was a love match. They had 4 children in rapid succession. 3 survived, which was about the standard ratio for white women in the 18th century. And in 1753, the family moved to England. They settled in a house, they called it a villa, in Ripley, a small village about 25 miles southwest of London. And this is an aerial shot of Ripley, what they call Ripley House now, which I got to visit. The tree in the bottom left of the photograph, locals say was planted by an American wayfarer in the 18th century, a woman named Eliza. So the Pinckneys did not go to England to live as tourists. They wanted to live as English landed gentry. And so the way they went about doing that was the same way they tried to live as English people in South Carolina, and that was through consumption. They renovated the house. I mean, they lived only in part of this. It's been added on to over the decades and centuries. They renovated the house. They bought his and hers carriages so that they could ride around the countryside. On Connie's digital edition, you can see the listing of the materials that they purchased while they were in London. They kept copious records, and it's just, scores of silver place settings, dozens of chairs, stacks and stacks of table linen, set after set of china, handcrafted chafing dishes for parties. And the thing that got me the most was 3 punch bowls. I thought, who in the world needs 3 punch bowls? Well, I guess the Pinckneys did when they entertained. All of this was acquired from profits from their South Carolina plantations, so that their very English lifestyle of conspicuous consumption was funded by American slavery. So Eliza's descendants kept some of her material possessions. All of these are housed at the Charleston Museum. I don't know if anyone from the Eliza Lucas Pinckney chapter of the DAR is on the Zoom tonight, but the DAR has recently, I guess in the last 2-3 years, fundraised to begin a very much needed elaborate restoration or renovation, I guess, of the salmon and cream colored dress that Eliza wore and successive generations of Pinckney women wore. In 1758, the Pinckneys made a return trip to Carolina. Charles caught malaria and died, and Eliza was completely shattered. Was, she told friends, deprived of what I held most dear upon earth. And a year later, she's still detailing the grief. My soul is oppressed with bitter anguish beyond the power of words to utter. But she had to crawl out of her grief because she had 3 children to raise as a single mother. Her 2 sons, Charles Cotesworth, who was 12 when his father died, and Thomas, who were 8, were still in London at their studies, and 10-year-old Harriet had traveled back to South Carolina with Eliza. So as you've intuited by now, the Pinckneys were among the richest people in colonial South Carolina. When Charles died, besides the villa in Ripley, they owned a mansion on East Bay in Charleston, lavish estate outside of town called Belmont, several other houses in the city, and countless smaller rental and investment properties, as well as 9 plantations spread throughout the Low Country, thousands upon thousands of acres, stretching all the way into Georgia. Eliza, at 35, took charge of it all. She was the principal beneficiary of the will. She was the guardian of the minor children, and she was the executrix of the will. There was, she said, nobody to call me to account. And she kept it that way. A second marriage, she explained, never once entered into my head. So Eliza returned after Charles's death to her role as an independent planter patriarch, with the mission of setting the Pinckney family back on a rock-solid foundation of wealth and prominence. Many of the properties had fallen into disrepair during their long absence in England. She diversified her holdings in the 1760s and early 1770s, purchasing, she explained, different kinds of property in 4 or 5 different parts of the country. Meanwhile, she raised 3 very accomplished children, 2 across an ocean via surrogates and advisory letters. She did not see her sons for over a decade because she determined that protecting their future, which lay in South Carolina, was more important than being in their presence. She was successful. By the time Eliza turned 40, she could say something uncommon for anyone, man or woman, in the 18th century. I live here, agreeable to my own taste. When she turned 50 in 1772, she was satisfied and secure, proud of her now grown children, of her thriving businesses, of her vast wealth, and looking forward to retirement. She used the same language that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson used about their retirement. She said she wanted to live under her own vine and fig tree. So Thomas was on his way back from England, having finished his education. Harriet was now married. Charles Cotesworth was married and firmly established in South Carolina politics. And they were in the early 1770s living a life of privilege and plenty and independence. Independence that Eliza had ensured for them all through her determination, her savvy innovations, and her ruthless brutality. And then the American Revolution occurred, and her world caved in, and her independence was shattered. So, most of the time when we think about the American Revolution, we think about it from the point of view of powerful men in legislative halls and knee breeches designing the future for the American Republic, or valiantly facing down, patriots facing down the British redcoats. This is a kind of romantic and masculine view of the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War, but it's only in paintings that war is romantic and all male. Eliza experienced a very different kind of women's war during the American Revolution, and there was no romance on the front lines in real time. For example, when the British launched a massive offensive against Charleston in May of 1780. So this was the carnage that was unleashed on the city, and the British occupation continued for 2.5 years. For Eliza Lucas Pinckney, these years of the American Revolution were about losing, not gaining, independence. She was financially ruined. British forces expelled her from her townhouse, and they seized Belmont, her principal a plantation just north of town. Soldiers carried off her cattle and cut down her timber. Her rental houses in Charlestown were confiscated too. To her mortification, she said, "I am without a place to lay my head." Her 3 children suffered too, in different ways, and Eliza felt powerless to help them. Harriet's husband, Daniel Lorri, renounced his patriot allegiance after the siege of Charlestown and reclaimed his British loyalty, which in the short term alienated him from his extended family, and in the long term jeopardized Harriet's estate. Meanwhile, Charles Cotesworth and Thomas, who were serving in the war, became prisoners of war, and Thomas was also gravely wounded. His leg was shattered in the battle at Camden, and for months, his new bride picked bone shards out of his leg. And then the 2 brothers were forced into exile in Philadelphia, where they lived in relative ease and comfort thanks to well-connected friends, while Harriet and Eliza stayed behind in charge of all of the family's holdings and in danger. In 1781 and 1782, resentment over the British occupation of Charlestown unleashed in South Carolina a civil and guerrilla war. Lawlessness became the new normal. And the people who were in this war zone were mostly women and children. The plantations and farms where men waged war were mostly populated by women, including women like Eliza Lucas Pinckney and Harriet Pinckney Lorri, because deployments and wartime death had made South Carolina's white households decidedly female-centered, and that was before the fall of Charlestown, before thousands more men were taken prisoner of war. So the infliction of destruction on women's houses, on their fields, on their farm animals, and on their livelihoods was not just an inadvertent consequence of the war, but it was an intentional policy. British occupying troops pursued a total war and tried to break the will of patriot women, and by extension men, and the patriots then matched them step by step. Amid all of the chaos that consumed South Carolina during the Revolutionary War, Eliza tried to strengthen her exhausted daughter-in-law, the one picking out the bone shards, Thomas's leg. And this is maybe my favorite of all quotes of Eliza Lucas Pinckney. Fortitude, she reminded her daughter-in-law, is as much a female as a masculine virtue. During the long, terrible war, Eliza was often afraid and generally furious at having to sacrifice her independence, what she devoted her life to creating. She felt humiliated and angry to admit in 1742 that she lacked the funds to pay a 60-pound bill. A strange concurrence of circumstances must happen, she complained, before a person so situated as I was should become this destitute. Well, the Pinckney family rebounded in the way that rich and well-connected people usually rebound. Eliza lived another decade, again in the splendor of her youth, but no longer independent now. She lived mostly with her daughter Harriet and sometimes in her son's houses. So to give you an example of how the Pinckney family rebounded, on the left is Harriet's estate, Hampton, which you can still visit. To the right is Thomas's house, really Thomas's second wife's house. And an architectural historian from the city can correct me, but I believe Charles Coatsworth Pinckney owned the greenhouse on Rainbow Row. In any event, they lived in great luxury, high style. After the Revolution, as they had done before, their wealth purchased through slavery. Every part of Eliza's life was embedded in racial exploitation, from her birth in Antigua until her death of breast cancer 70 years later. Throughout her long life, Eliza kept safe what I like to think of as her most prized and certainly most important possession, the letter book she'd started as a girl. That flawed treasure and the many varied other writings that she produced over the course of her long and interesting life opens up a fresh, vital perspective on early America. There are many lessons in Eliza's life. The long legacy of racial power in this country, how important it is to be a good record keeper, and what can happen if you are audacious and defy convention. But to me, as an historian, maybe the most important legacy is the reminder that when we consider a point of view on the past, when we try to think about understanding the 17th, 18th, 19th, or 20th centuries, we would do well to pause for just a moment and ask the question that Eliza asked 279 years ago. Why not a woman? Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that we can have questions, comments, objections, and observations.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Glover. I will look for some questions now, and I think I saw some coming up. So hang on. One I did see was that did she have any business dealings or dealings with Henry Lawrence?
So one of the interesting interconnections I found with Henry Lawrence was related to religion. I don't believe, so they both were very devout people. You know, colonial South Carolinians have the reputation of being not very religious. And the two most prolific colonial South Carolinians, Henry Lawrence and Eliza Lucas Pinckney, give lie to that. They were quite religious people. I don't recall that she had specific business transactions with Henry Lawrence.
I have another question that asks you to talk a little more about Eliza's ruthless brutality.
Well, I think you have to be ruthlessly brutal to manage plantations in the South Carolina Low Country in the 18th century for decades. And that's in fact what she did. She lived through the Great Awakening when white people began to challenge the morality of slaveholding. She lived, most of her life as a white minority in a Black majority. That was the case in Antigua. That was in case at different times in the South Carolina Low Country. It was certainly the case on the plantations where she resided. And so she met with, lifelong questioning of slavery from enslaved people. She lived through the American Revolution, when white people began to question the efficacy and morality and legality of slavery. Her life came to an end in Philadelphia, which by the time she had gone there for breast cancer treatment, the state had moved toward a gradual emancipatory program, and the city had founded the first anti-slavery society in North America, in the Americas. None of that changed Eliza's attitude about slavery. And so that, I think, is an important thing to keep in mind. It was important for me because sometimes, I liked her so much and admired her so much in so many ways. And so I always kept thinking about that other side of her life as well, or that central side of her life. But that's why I say that she was ruthlessly brutal.
Interesting. Yeah. And another asked you to speak to Eliza's relationship with her white plantation overseers.
To speak to her relationship with
her white plantation overseers.
Oh, so she corresponded with overseers from time to time, and they reacted to her much the same way that overseers reacted to white plantation owners, that she was the person in charge. She wanted things done in a particular way. So there was no, she didn't ask them for favors. She told them what she wanted done. And Harriet Pinckney Oread does this as well. So, there were some things that Eliza could not do as a woman. She could not hold political office. She could not be directly engaged in politics. But many of the other things that she did in her life really crossed the gender line in a profound and sustained way. And other Carolinians, white Carolinians, men respected her, and they respected her authority and her power, whether that was an overseer on another plantation or, a colonial governor.
Right, Okay, thank you. One person asked, was it her son who was in charge of the Southern Theater during the War of 1812? And I'm not sure about that. There are a lot of Pinckneys and a lot of
and a lot of Charles Pinckneys, and so I do not know.
I'm not sure about that one either.
If you go to Connie Schultz's new project on the Pinckney Digital Statesman, you will find the answer to your question.
There you go. Excellent. And someone asked, is the Pinckney estate in England still standing, the one you had the photograph of? I assume.
Yes, it is, but it's been added onto, and it is home to several different people. So it's carved up into not apartments. I guess it's more like condos. And so I didn't get to go inside anybody's house, but I got to go. They let me go around the grounds and talk to me about life at Ripley House. And so I got to be in this space that she was in, but not the inside space. But yes, it's still there.
Okay, that's fascinating. It was fun to visit, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Someone asked to please list the books again that you mentioned in the opening comments.
Barbara Oberg has edited recently a book called Women and the American Revolution, and that's out of the University of Virginia Press. That is a collection of essays about different women in revolutionary America, some of them entrepreneurs and business owners. One, a planter from Virginia who shares a lot in common with Eliza Pinckney. Her name is Mary Willing Bird. The book in the middle is about, well, I can just show the slide. Maybe that would be the easiest thing to do. The book in the middle is about a sort of wayfaring woman, a British woman, Elizabeth Marsh. Marsh, it's called A Woman in World History. That's by Linda Colley. And then the co-author book by Canlin and Pybus is on Black women, entrepreneurs, slaveholders, and commercial planters in the Caribbean. So those are books that will sort of challenge what you think women were doing in the 18th century world.
Wonderful. I look forward to reading those.
And they're all very well written.
Hang on, I lost my place here. I was trying to go in order of how they were asked. We will not have time for all of them, but we are going to try a few more. Someone says her son, Charles Coatsworth, founded the Charleston Bible Society along with their fourth great-grandfather, slave trader William Payne, and saying, how do you explain the hypocrisy?
Well, maybe even more than that, Eliza began a school at Wapu for enslaved girls to teach them how to read, which was part of sort of an extension of a project that a rector in Charleston, Alexander Garden, had started to try and teach enslaved people to read so that they could be evangelized by the Anglican Church. That's a really good question. How can you reconcile that? And the answer, well, it's a complicated answer. So I would go back to the early 18th century, when there is very little questioning of the efficacy and morality of slavery from white people, including deeply religious white people, whether they're Anglican or Huguenot or Puritan in New England. And so, you know, that's a larger story of racial power being affected through religion rather than challenged by religion. Why the Great Awakening? Why the American Revolution? Why the rise of moral condemnations of slavery did not challenge Eliza's views or of her sons? I mean, you know, Charles Coatsworth is at the Constitutional Convention, and his most important stand is to ensure that slavery is written into the Constitution of the United States. So why they didn't have a moral awakening, I think, has a lot to do with their wealth and their power and their disinterest in giving up their wealth, power, prominence, prestige, lifestyle, homes, because all of it depended on slavery.
Okay, and I think you hinted at this. The next question is, did Eliza have any interaction with Dr. Alexander Garden, Charleston physician and botanist?
Yes. So she went to his church. They corresponded with one another. She followed that example of his school. And then while Charles and Eliza were in England, his son was in school there and behaving very, very badly. And so they tried to have an intervention with the young man and get him on the right track, as did other Carolinians who were in London. They did not have any luck with that. So yes, she was, you know, they knew one another, they were friends, and she was an enthusiastic supporter of his, including his brand of Christianity. I mean, she did not go in for the evangelicalism when George Whitefield and others came into the Low Country.
Interesting. Another good question. What was the reaction of society to Eliza's business dealings and management of her father's estate as quite a young woman? Was it considered inappropriate, or did her immense wealth and social standing keep her above reproach?
Well, that is a really central question to everything that I wrote about it in the book. I think it's the second part of your answer. So they were very well to do. She was very well read. She was attractive in every way that mattered in 18th century South Carolina society. That is, she was graceful, she was gracious, she was eloquent, she was well read, she was thoughtful, she cared about botanical pursuits and commerce. And so the fact that she fit in quite well, and she upheld so many of the standards of 18th century South Carolina of refinement, of racial power, of class privilege, of sort of the performance of gentility. And she was very good at what she did. I mean, she was bold, she was determined, she was imaginative, she was very intelligent. And so she earned people's respect in part by her skill as a planter, and in part by her skill in performing traditional elite female roles.
She was quite the woman, wasn't she? The next question is, what do you find are the most useful materials for reconstructing historical characters? Was it Eliza's letter book that was most helpful, or do you connect more with material culture like visits to actual spaces?
So when I started as an historian and I wrote my dissertation, I went to Charleston because that's where the materials were. They were at the South Carolina Historical Society and at the Caroliniana Library in Columbia. And I thought the way to get at the history was to read as many of the primary sources as I possibly could and support that with as many of the secondary sources as I possibly could. I arrived on a Sunday and I thought I would go to the archives on Monday morning. And it turned out that the South Carolina Historical Society was closed on Monday morning. And so I walked around Charleston and I got to see some of the spaces that I was exploring. That was completely happenstance. It was sort of an accident because it hadn't really occurred to me that I needed to see the material world of my subjects. I thought I could get at them through text. I still am a person of text. I believe in reading as many primary sources as you can, but I have grown as an historian, I think, to appreciate that you really cannot understand the past without getting as close as you can to the material culture of that past, to the architecture, to the clothing, to the foodways. And so, I went to Antigua, I went to London, I went to Philadelphia, I went, all through the low country to every spot I could find that I thought Eliza had ever been. I went on the tour at Hampton. I visited Snee Farm where her nephew lived, fantastic sites in the low country, because I had learned that that was really important to the history. So now I think you have to do both. I think you do primary sources in the traditional sense, that is letters and diaries and correspondence, newspapers, and you do primary sources that get to how people lived, what they ate, what they wore, the houses they lived in, and so on.
There's just something about seeing the things they saw. It's just, yeah, it just brings you closer somehow. Okay, I think we have time for one more, if that's okay with you,
Sure.
Dr. Glover. Did Eliza interact or write about Susanna Smith Elliott?
Not that I can recall.
Okay, and I'm going to do one more since that was short. This is from George in Virginia. Did she have clear title to her estate, to real property?
So when Charles died, she did not actually prove the will. The will was not adjudicated until Charles Cotesworth Pinckney was ready to come back to South Carolina and take charge of his part of the inheritance. And at that point, he produced the will in an English court. But that was 10 or 12 years after the fact. So, you know, in a way, the answer is it doesn't matter, because she could buy and sell property, both real estate and human beings. She collected the profits, she invested the profits, and so it was, in a sense, it was hers. Now, she made her principal residence at Belmont, not at the house in the city. And so when Charles Coatsworth came back, he moved in to the city house, which she had access to, but he had technical ownership once he, you know, proved the will.
Okay,
I want to go back to the question about Eliza's correspondence, and just say anyone who's doing work on a South Carolina subject, if you go to the digital edition of Eliza Lucas Pinckney and Harriet Pinckney Ory, or the Pinckney Digital Statesman, those documents are all searchable, but by individual. And so I could be wrong about the woman that the question was about. That I don't remember that woman in the correspondence, but my memory could be faulty. But you could do a quick check. You could do a quick check there and find out for sure.
And that is one great thing about that wonderful project that Connie and her team have been working on. So yes, definitely visit the digitization project on the Pinckney papers. I am so sorry, that is all we have time for. You all have had some wonderful questions, and Dr. Glover, this has just been, I thought I knew everything there was to know about Eliza Lucas Pinckney, and you have educated me greatly. So thank you so much for this. Thanks to everyone who is in attendance tonight. I hope you'll join us next week when we will learn about inland rice cultivation with Dr. Hayden Smith of the College of Charleston. Once again, have a lovely evening. And Dr. Glover, thank you again very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for taking time out of your evening and for the great questions. I really enjoyed being with you.
We enjoyed being with you as well. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.